My name is Emma Paulino, and I will be your host for this event, which is included in the FIP Virtual 2020 series of events. So today we will be talking about influenza vaccination, strategic elements of development, supply and delivery for optimal prevention, which is included in a series which aims to increase vaccination coverage through pharmacists. And I will start a small presentation just to highlight how we will organize the session today, and then I will proceed with introducing the speakers for today. So I've already mentioned the topic, and thank you so much for your interest in this event in particular. So I've already also introduced myself. So my name is Emma and I'm professional secretary of FIP. I would like just to give you some short announcements, housekeeping rules. So this webinar, for your information, is being recorded, and it's also being live streamed via Facebook. The recording will be afterwards available on our website, www.fip.org. You may ask questions using the question box provided, and you are also welcome to provide feedback to webinars@fip.org. We also invite you to become a member of the International Pharmaceutical Federation, and you can use the link that's highlighted in the slide. But if you go to our homepage, it's also quite easy to find more information about membership benefits and how you can apply to become a member. So in terms of this session in particular, and because we would like to use as much time as possible to discuss the actual topic, I will be very brief in presenting to you the learning objectives. Hopefully, and we expect to present and discuss the WHO Global Influenza Surveillance and Response Systems, strain selection process, and the criticality of WHO collaboration with influenza vaccine manufacturer. We also want to describe challenges and mitigations and their potential impact on vaccine supply. We want to provide an overview to public health importance of influenza vaccination. Further on, we would like to describe the public health importance of influenza vaccination and the role and challenges pharmacists may or do face when vaccinating people against influenza. We also want to explain how seasonal influenza vaccination by pharmacists adds value to the healthcare system and how this offers benefit in an influenza pandemic. And finally, we want to enumerate the barriers and challenges faced by pharmacists who want to become influenza vaccinators and explore how might these be reduced or mitigated. And finally, discuss how flu vaccine manufacturers might support broadening the understanding of pharmacists with their expanding role to become influenza vaccinators. We would like to highlight and thank Ifpma for their support to this event. So thank you very much. And this is really a partnership we value in order to increase awareness of the role and capacity of pharmacists to vaccinate, and also to identify ways in which we can facilitate the implementation of vaccination by pharmacists in different countries and regions. As for the program, I already did a small introduction to the topic, and following this small introduction, we will have an introduction to Ifpma vaccine supply. Then we will have a presentation on seasonal influenza vaccines, on the global strategic elements of development and supply. And finally, we will look at community pharmacies' preparedness for the coming flu season in times of COVID-19. So you saw the names of the speakers in the slides, but I will introduce them as their presentation is going to happen. After each presentation, after the presentations, we will have a small period of panel discussion with questions from the audience. So again, we invite you to use the chat box to make any comments you would like, and then we have the Q&A section so that you can ask questions to the panelists. And finally, we'll have some closing remarks. And we really need to finish on time because we have a very full day of events as part of the FIP virtual event 2020. So without further ado, I would like to present our first speaker. And our first speaker is Dr. Bram Palaci. Dr. Bram Palaci, and I will make very short introductions, and I'm sure you can find more information about our speakers online. But Dr. Palaci received his master's degree in biochemistry at the University of Amsterdam in 1980. After graduation, he initiated his professional career as a clinical research associate at Solvay Pharmaceuticals in the Netherlands. And throughout the years, he gained a lot of experience in clinical development of new drugs in various fields and industries. He's most notably, he's a co-founder of the European Scientific Working Group on Influenza, which was founded in 1992. Since 2001, he's a member of the External Affairs Working Group of the Association of the European Vaccine Manufacturers. And in 2005, he joined the Influenza Working Group, which he co-chaired in 2009. Finally, I would just like to highlight another important aspect of Dr. Palaci's experience. In 2003, he became the founding member of Ifpma's Influenza Vaccine Supply International Task Force, and since 2004, he chairs the Policy, Practice and Communication subgroup of this organization. In 2006, he joined the Asian Pacific Advisory Committee Influenza Group as an industry representative. You will see how passionate Dr. Bram Palaci is about these topics if you haven't already perceived from this extensive experience that Dr. Palaci has in founding and being a part of various influenza groups. Dr. Palaci, it's really a pleasure to have you here presenting to us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Emma, with this introduction. Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everybody. This session is about influenza. Next slide, maybe. I don't need the declaration of interest after the introduction by Emma, so we can skip this one and go to the content of this presentation. This is going to be about influenza, and because we are in the middle of a corona pandemic, it's a bit counterintuitive to talk about and focus on influenza. However, influenza is another important and potentially disruptive infectious disease, which has caused pandemics in the past, such as the Spanish flu in 1918, but also in 1957, in 1968, and in 2009. In addition, influenza causes considerable disease and economic burden every year, the so-called seasonal influenza. And for these reasons, I believe it's very much justified to talk about influenza, even in the middle of this corona pandemic. There are many overlapping experiences and learnings from both influenza and COVID-19 infectious diseases and pandemics. One key important lesson, maybe I should say a reminder from the current COVID-19 experience, is the absolute critical need for very different stakeholders to collaborate and join efforts to prepare for and to fight against the infectious diseases with pandemic potential, such as influenza and COVID-19. In this session, my colleague, Dr. Matthew Downham, and I will present and review the strategic elements of vaccine development and supply and discuss the importance of collaboration. We'll do this on behalf of Ifpma. Next slide, please. The Ifpma is an international non-profit, non-governmental organization. It represents 31 R&D-based pharmaceutical industries with more than 50 members and affiliate associations from developed and developing countries, as you will see in the next slide. It's established in 2002. From the group, it has 15 influenza vaccine industry members from around the world, from China, from Japan, from Australia, US, Europe, and members of Ifpma, IVS task group, produce most of the world's influenza vaccines and conduct the necessary R&D to manufacture safe and effective and high quality vaccines to really protect as much as we can against seasonal and pandemic influenza. It's a key partner in the fight against influenza. And as you can see, both Matthew and myself, we are members of the core team who are presenting the leadership of this group. Next slide, please. Here you see the number and names of the members of Ifpma, as I said, from all over the world. Next. The objectives of the Ifpma and the IVS task force is to address the whole field: advocacy, communication, policy making, regulatory, scientific and technical issues, all related to seasonal and pandemic influenza vaccines. And with that, we try to strengthen the public health and industry approaches. And we do that in different ways, working with governments and intergovernmental bodies. We are assisting public bodies in preparations against pandemic, so-called the pandemic preparedness. And we assist to resolve development, testing, manufacturing, capacity building, licensing, the whole field, I would say, around vaccines, and not only vaccines, but of course also immunization, because we talk a lot about vaccines, but vaccines do not protect against disease. It's the act of immunization which is protecting people. Next slide, please. Now, if I talk in general terms for this introduction about the critical need for collaboration, we are, as Ifpma, very glad with the collaboration with the FRP, which exists already for a number of years. And we have participated in events organized by FRP on different occasions and in different of their meetings. And we are very, very happy to continue that tradition, I would say, and this collaboration, even in this difficult times of the corona pandemic, but that we are able to continue our partnership, a relationship with FIP, trying to help and support infectious disease control and management. Next slide, please. And in last January, Ifpma has taken an initiative, and FRP is one of the participants, to develop a network, an influenza network with many stakeholders and organizations trying to unite in terms of advocacy immunization against influenza, because we all know that the uptake rates of flu immunizations are suboptimal and are absent in many countries even. So there's lots to do, and because of the need for collaboration, we are very, very happy that also this new initiative is participated by the FRP. And we want to thank FRP for their efforts as well. Next slide. And here I present a video which is summarizing basically the objectives of all of us in trying to control influenza, but basically infectious diseases in a much better way than we do today. fewer people in these beds. That's the simple message. It's so frustrating. It's so frustrating to see people suffering and dying even from an infection which is avoidable and preventable. What drives me crazy is that the influenza story, in principle, is extremely simple. We know there is a serious disease, it's occurring every year, and we have safe and effective vaccines. The more people who are vaccinated and protected, the less other people are vulnerable for getting influenza infections. By the way, you cannot get flu from the flu shot. There are millions on a yearly basis globally who get hospitalized for complications due to influenza infections. One thing is certain, more vaccinations means fewer people in hospitals, fewer people in these beds. That's the simple message. But instead of increasing, we see decreasing vaccination rates with the potential of more disease than is necessary. So just take your diary. For the Southern Hemisphere, somewhere in May. For the Northern Hemisphere, in the October-November period. Have a date in your agenda. This is to get my flu jab. Full stop. As simple as that. And that would have a tremendous positive effect on personal health and on public health in the society. After so many years in this field, this has been my attempt to make a difference. Even if you have a year where the vaccine is less effective than in other years, an annual shot against influenza will make a huge difference. So this brings me to the concluding remarks of this introduction. First, the COVID-19 pandemic is really a reminder to humankind to appreciate the achievements of vaccines for health and social life. Influenza immunization practices for at-risk patients are often insufficient, and the result is serious disease, death, pressure on national health systems and professionals, social disruptions with serious economic implications. Improving flu immunization practices require structural and collaborative efforts by professionals and organizations providing healthcare services to at-risk patients. And clear, balanced, and consistent communications about flu disease and the vaccines are paramount to motivate patients to trust immunization advice. And I'd like to leave it here and give the word to my colleague, Matthew.
Thank you very much, Bram, and thank you so much for sharing this powerful video. I know that we have a Q&A at the end of the session, but we already have one question here, whether we can access the video to share via social networks. So maybe you can clarify whether this video is available for dissemination?
Yes, it is.
Fantastic. So we will be sharing the link so you can use this very powerful video, and it sends a very simple message. And it looks like a simple strategy, but actually it's being discussed throughout these years, and we seem far from achieving the ideal coverage rate. So, and now we will proceed with the presentation from Ifpma, and we will be talking now about the global strategic elements of development and supply of seasonal influenza vaccines. And we have with us Dr. Matthew Downham, who will talk about this topic. Dr. Downham completed a bachelor's degree in industrial biology from the London South Bank Polytechnic, a PhD in biochemical engineering from Birmingham University, a postdoctoral fellowship in biomolecular sciences from the Liverpool John Moores University, and a postgraduate certificate in education from Bolton Institute, all in the UK. He has worked in biopharmaceutical industry since 1997 and chairs the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations Vaccines Europe Influenza Working Group, is a treasurer of the Ifpma Influenza Vaccine Supply Chain International Force, and is vice chair of the Ifpma Convention on Biological Diversity working group. So thank you so much, Matthew, for agreeing to be with us today, and the floor is yours.
Emma, thank you very much indeed, and thank you also to your FIP colleagues for allowing Bram and I to present today on behalf of the Ifpma IVS. I do work for AstraZeneca in Liverpool in the UK, but I'm presenting today primarily on behalf of the IVS group. So maybe you can jump to the next slide, please. Okay, and the next slide. So I'm going to be talking today in largely two areas, and this is captured by some of the learning objectives that Emma outlined earlier. Firstly, to introduce everyone and discuss the global influenza surveillance and response system that's run by the WHO, but primarily to focus in on kind of the collaborative aspects to resolve challenges, address issues, mitigate problems, etc. The other part of this presentation is largely to explain how seasonal influenza vaccination can be delivered by pharmacists and how that adds value to healthcare systems and benefits, particularly in an influenza pandemic, but also in a COVID-19 setting. We can't forget that, and the looming Northern Hemisphere winter that's coming upon us quite quickly in a COVID setting, as it were. So this kind of breaks out two of the topics I'm going to cover today. And largely for the second component, I'll be referring back to a session that Bram and I had the honor of giving, chairing at the FIP Congress in Abu Dhabi last year, with a selection of about 110, 120 pharmacists in the room. It was a very, very productive session. I'm going to share some feedback from that. So maybe if we go to the next slide, please. Okay, so at the session in Abu Dhabi last year, I presented on the left-hand side, you can see this, what I call the long and winding road leading to your door, to the pharmacist's door. How do we go from seasonal or the kind of circulating influenza viruses to a vaccine? And it is a collaborative journey from the virus to vaccine supply. And it all starts with the initial component, the brown component at the top there, in terms of monitoring of the influenza circulating on the planet, the different types in the northern and the southern hemisphere, and how the WHO and industry collaborate together to identify what the vaccine component should be. And this is primarily what I'm going to be focusing on in this presentation today. That is the top part of this long and winding road, as it were. Next slide, please. So the global influenza surveillance and response system, well, what is it? So around the world, there are what are called national influenza centers. There are about 152 in about 113 countries, and they're represented on this slide by the little blue triangles that you can see globally in all continents of the planet. They are where initial samples of suspected influenza are collected and initial analysis is performed. So they may receive sputum samples or samples from clinics or hospitals. They do the initial analysis to say yes or no, there's an influenza strain in that sample. They will then send those influenza positive samples to one of 5 global national collaborating centers. There's one in Atlanta, in Georgia, in the CDC in the US. There's one in London here in the UK at the Crick Institute. And there's one in Beijing in China, one in Tokyo, as you can see. And then the only one in the Southern Hemisphere is in Melbourne in Australia. And these 5 collaborating centers coordinate receipt of those samples from the national influenza centers and do an incredible amount of work to characterize those strains and map the epidemiology upon which the flu vaccine recommendations are made. Given the way flu viruses can transition from animal to human populations, there is also an ecology influenza collaborating centre that looks at kind of the animal circulation, zoonotic components. And there are also reference laboratories and what are called essential regulatory laboratories that support the WHO with preparing the strains into candidate vaccine viruses, vaccine strains, the kind of critical reagents that we need to support vaccine manufacture and release, and all of the components for regulatory submissions. As you can see, this is not an institute, this GISRS is not something that started yesterday. In fact, in 2017, they celebrated their 65th anniversary of existence under the WHO Global Influenza Programme that itself was 70 years old in 2017. And it is interestingly probably the longest running and oldest single pathogen surveillance and response system on the planet. And it's looked at with some envy for lessons to be learned for other diseases. And COVID, for example, is a good example for how this system has been leveraged for the current pandemic. Maybe to the next slide, please. So what else is the challenge with influenza? Well, influenza is a master of disguise. It can drift or it can shift. It can mutate and change either very quickly within a season, within 1 year, or over a series of years. And that creates the problem of, well, is there a new strain evolving? Is it more pathogenic? Does the vaccine match the strain that's circulating? So despite the fact they're very similar in overall structure, and there's two envelope proteins, surface proteins, the hemagglutinin and the neuraminidase, they mutate and they change such they have different infectious capabilities. So the vaccine that's developed comprises typically of 2A strains, which are the most common. They cause the pandemics, for example. They infect not just humans, but horses, pigs, bird species. And there's multiple subtypes, hence you get H1N1 and H3N2, etc. So vaccines typically comprise of quadrivalent formulation. So it's 2A strains, 2B strains. There are some vaccines that just have 1B strain, so they're trivalent formulations. The B strains, as you can see, they're milder than the A strain. They only infect humans. There's one NA, one HA subtype surface protein, but they form 2 lineages. So this is the surveillance that the WHO does. We go to the next slide. And what they do as well is monitor global circulation. As a result, there is a northern and a southern hemisphere strain recommendation. And Bram already spoke about that with marking the calendar as to when, depending on which hemisphere you're in, you should be looking to get your vaccination. So new strains, they circulate each year. They differ between the global hemispheres and regions. And you have separate epidemics during the winter months. So at the moment, you can see we're in September, 16th of September. In the northern hemisphere, typically, the flu strains would be starting to increase, whilst in the southern hemisphere, the flu strains circulation will be starting to decrease. And what we've seen there is the kind of paradigm that you see an increase in the northern hemisphere, a decrease in the southern hemisphere, and that is repeated as we transition through the winter months. So that epidemiological dynamic is something else the WHO are keeping a very close eye on. And interestingly, given the lockdown as a result of COVID-19, there is actually very little influenza circulating globally, which will create a problem in itself as to what they recommend. And the first recommendation in a COVID setting is coming up next week, actually, for the Southern Hemisphere 2021, with the WHO's recommendation. Next slide, please. So the collaborative relationship helps improve vaccine supply, it addresses issues, it helps with strategy planning. And we meet with the WHO influenza group, industry meets with the WHO influenza group every other week by teleconference, but primarily twice per year face-to-face, typically not in a COVID setting. The vaccine committee meets typically in Geneva, and that is the WHO collaborating centers. So they're the 5, Atlanta, London, Beijing, Japan, Melbourne, as well as the animal groups, the animal flu network, as well as the ERLs, the National Influenza Centers, the facility in Memphis that looks at the ecology aspects of influenza, and delegates from Cambridge University that do some important cartography and mapping of flu strains. Based on the data that GISRS gathers together, they make a recommendation for the Northern Hemisphere. It's in February each year. For the Southern Hemisphere, it's September each year. So the September one is next Friday. And what the WHO do is summarize what they've now analyzed from the global circulating seasonal and zoonotic influenza strains. In other words, those of pandemic potential. They talk about the distributions of the strains between the national influenza centers to those core kind of collaborating centers, the different subtypes, and the antigenic and genetic components and characterization. They look at a multitude of aspects from phenotype to hereditary relationships, strain emergency, the important cartography that's done here in the UK at Cambridge University, sequence homology, the capability to propagate in egg and or cell, which relates to how we manufacture the vaccines, etc. You can see the rest of the things there. And in terms also of the zoonotic virus transmission. So that's the diagram, the schematic in the bottom right-hand corner, mapping the transition of virus between porcine and avian species to humans to look for signs of pandemic outbreak, as it were. The decision is made over a closed meeting, and then there's an announcement to industry where the WHO recommends the 2A strains, the 2B strains, and like strains. In other words, if you cannot make that particular strain for your vaccine, then other strains are sufficiently similar that they can also be used in your vaccine. And that's an important component in terms of vaccine supply. The recommendation plus the like strains are published by the WHO on their website. They have the WHO Influenza webpage where all of this information can be found. And that is really the kind of strain recommendation that is so key to the vaccine manufacturers that we need to support. If we go to the next slide, we can see how this recommendation fits in to the overall kind of timeline for supply. And this schematic was prepared by Sam Lee, who Bram mentioned or showed a little earlier, part of the IBS core team, and has prepared this presentation, prepared this slide, which has some schematics on it that you can see. So you can see, this is for Northern Hemisphere, you can see the strain selection, so the CDC, the FDA, WHO, the GISRS feed that we get, the surveillance and the reassortment work that goes on prior to that, leading up to it, to the Northern Hemisphere winter season. Industry look at that information and they will start producing candidate vaccine viruses at risk. They will do that at risk because, of course, when the strain selection comes along, the WHO might recommend something that manufacturers have not made. So that is the risk element. And this is where the collaboration and the close interaction with the WHO is so key, so that we understand, manufacturers understand what strains are predominating, what strains we are basically putting at risk to manufacture, so that when we have the strain recommendation, we are in as fit a position as possible to continue production of the remaining strains, do the strain balancing, we have to do formulation work and testing, we have to do release, we have to do the license approval to get the vaccine filled, packaged, distributed, and to your door, pharmacists or healthcare professionals, for vaccination end of August, early September, to achieve the herd immunity that Bram has already clarified and talked about in his presentation. This is a limited time, it's 6 months basically from supply. Any delay in strain selection, any delay in manufacture, production at risk, impacts vaccine distribution. And Emma, if you just press another click, we can see the animation here. That's it, that's brilliant, thank you. So you can see if strain selection is delayed for the Northern Hemisphere from February into mid-March, then it shifts everything to the right, and it means we're starting to vaccinate people in September or October. Typically, vaccination schemes will finish around October, November. You push them later and later, and then all you do is what you ultimately do is push vaccine supply and vaccination, putting at risk people that are not maybe covered through the Northern Hemisphere winter season, and ditto for the Southern Hemisphere. We just need to change the black line at the top for certain dates. So it's a narrow time window, it's time critical, it's multifactorial in terms of balancing the 4 strains, getting them made, and the collaboration is to get visibility to manufacture at risk so that we can meet the timeline to supply August or September for vaccinations in national immunization programs through pharmacists, through healthcare workers, to maximize that herd immunity. This is the kind of criticality and the challenge that we face. Where this comes in as well, so that's seasonal vaccination, where this comes in is in pandemic influenza. It also requires close global collaboration. And the GISRS system, as I mentioned, monitors not only seasonal flu, but pandemic emerging flu strains through the zoonotic evidence. What the Ifpma, IVS, and the international industry community do is work closely with the WHO to think about things like pandemic preparedness, issuing of the pandemic declaration, or the WHO public health emergency of international concern. And of course, there was one issued for COVID earlier this year as COVID began to escalate in global circulation. There's a coordinated response required. Human beings today travel en masse. There's many more of us. There's about 8 billion on the planet compared to the previous H1N1 pandemic over 100 years ago, when there was far fewer than 8 billion people, and people didn't travel as much. As a result, the virus spreads more rapidly today than it did in that last mass pandemic. People are naive. It's a strain that people's immune system has not been exposed to. So there's little or no pre-existing immunity. So that makes it more critical as well. What's required is prompt vaccine availability, requiring capacity to rapidly develop, manufacture, and supply, and ultimately through to not only the rapid, protective, durable immune response and few side effects, good compliance, but it's that mass vaccination. The image behind the text you can see is people lining up to receive a vaccination. If you think about mass vaccination to gain that herd immunity, you need to do that very, very quickly. And with 8 billion people on the planet, that is a very challenging situation. Hence, the need to leverage pharmacists to be part of that army, as it were, of people to vaccinate and provide that mass vaccination opportunity. So if we go to the next slide, and I realize I've got a few more minutes left. Last year at Abu Dhabi, Bram and I, as I mentioned, presented a workshop, and we talked about the benefits of pharmacists becoming flu vaccinators, the convenience on the high street, the ability to support advocacy to raise awareness, the information that pharmacists can provide to customers and patients regarding things like the safety of flu vaccination, etc. You can provide supported data for health monitoring to hospital doctors, to home doctors, etc. You can be trained to handle any adverse events, provide support and compliance, and ultimately, pharmacists can play a significant role supporting healthcare, public health systems, providing vaccines in a pandemic scenario. What we've just seen in the Southern Hemisphere 2020 in the latest flu vaccination is pharmacists being used more to deliver flu vaccines in a COVID-19 setting, which is obviously much more tricky. And that is being looked at for the Northern Hemisphere coming up, starting in a month or so's time, to support flu vaccination in the Northern Hemisphere. How do you deliver flu vaccines in a COVID-19 setting, given the social distancing, etc., that's required? And that's where pharmacists play a key and have played a key role, particularly in the Southern Hemisphere. In the discussions last year, we talked about the challenges of pharmacists becoming flu vaccinators, positioning pharmacists as additional healthcare professionals with responsibility for administering flu vaccinations, getting that recognition. It's the training and the education, not just of pharmacists, but of society, of communities, of healthcare professionals, of leading national political figures, legislative positioning and support to pharmacists becoming vaccinators. It's addressing geosocial differences and providing that government oversight and addressing incentive aspects. So this slide really kind of summarizes what Bram and I presented last year, and we were very grateful to the 100 and so pharmacists who attended that session, who really contributed to a very fruitful discussion that has resulted in this crystallized kind of list really of the benefits, but also the challenges and where things need to be addressed to support pharmacists becoming flu vaccinators. We jump to the last slide, next slide. Where IVS can support this, and again, we talked about this with your colleagues in the workshop in Abu Dhabi last year. Where can IVS support this, and where can we help address and mitigate identified challenges? Well, we can support broadening the understanding through things like education on supply chain, advocacy and communication, in-country support. So, for example, the session that Bram and I are very honoured to be able to deliver today helps kind of, I hope, deliver understanding and education on where the flu vaccines come from, how they are developed, the challenges we face, etc. We can support campaigns that support preparing populations to be vaccinated against flu pharmacists, so we can support the advocacy and the lobbying for that activity. We can support public stakeholder decision maker awareness raising through sessions, through position papers, etc. In other words, talk about how pharmacists as flu vaccinators are a positive way to increase vaccination rates. We can collaborate with pharmacists to predict shortage in vaccine supply, distribution, and better support what pharmacists need to do to help provide vaccination for their communities, whether they are on a high street, whether they are a traveling pharmacist, whether they are in a hospital setting, whatever it is. We can also support setting the political agenda with non- and/or government organizations and global stakeholders to drive towards implementation, which is key, of national strategies and policies that secure pharmacists becoming flu vaccinators in the future. So these last two slides really summarize the very fruitful discussion that Bram and I had with a number of pharmacists, 100 or so, in Abu Dhabi last year. And with that, I think I'm out of my time. And I'd like to thank Emma and the FIP once again for your opportunity to present today. And I look forward to the Q&A and discussions a little later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew, for this presentation. So in a very short time frame, you managed to walk us through the cycle and the strategic thinking and also implementation of the influenza preparedness system. So thank you so much. And thank you so much also for yours and Ifpma's continued support to FIP's strategy also to increase vaccination coverage through pharmacists. And lastly, I would like to present to you Hanne Andersen. Hanne is going to present us on the community pharmacies preparedness for the coming flu season in times of COVID-19. Hanne has had different positions in Nord's Medicinal Depot, which is the Norwegian subsidiary of the McKesson Group in Norway. She has done so until 2014, when she decided to establish her own private pharmacy and left this company. Morris Pharmacy is a local community pharmacy, and Hanne has worked as chief pharmacist from the start, so from its foundation until May this year. During this time, vaccination was introduced as a service in most Norwegian pharmacies, and Hanne has had experience from the practical work for the last two flu seasons. In May, Hanne joined the Pharmacy Association as Director for Pharmaceutical Affairs, and today vaccination and further development of the service is one of her responsibilities. So thank you so much, Hanne, for being with us today. So you have the political perspective, but also the hands-on perspective on implementing a vaccination service in community pharmacies. So we look forward to hear from you on this experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. In my presentation, I will first give you some facts about the Norwegian market, and then I will give you also some facts about the pandemic situation in Norway before I last but not least tell you more about the vaccine service we have in Norway. In the first slide, you see the market situation. We have today 975 pharmacies in the country, and the market has been deregulated since 2001. This means then that we have integrated pharmacy chains, and it's today 3 different international chains represented in the market. All these pharmacies are members of the Pharmacy Association, and that's important because we have a good tradition of cooperation when it comes to national services. We have worked together across the chains and been able to make fast decisions and to implement national standards in all the pharmacies. In the next slide, you see some demographic facts about our country. We are only 5.4 million inhabitants, and every inhabitant is entitled to have 1 GP. And every GP in the country has, in average, 1,100 patients. They have also a contract with the municipalities, so it's regulated. It's a regulated system. Seasonal influenza. We experience about 900 deaths every year, and we have 1.6 million persons in the risk groups. The target of vaccine coverage is 75%, as stated by the WHO. Last year, the coverage in Norway was only 39%. So we have a job to do. In Norway, the municipalities is responsible for the flu vaccination program, and the vaccines are distributed by the Norwegian Institute of Public Health. We have 356 different municipalities, so it varies how this is organized out in the municipalities and how the GPs administer the vaccines to the patients they have on their list, which then is in the risk groups. There is no reimbursement system for the vaccines in Norway. We have a fixed price on the vaccine, but it varies how much the people have to pay for the administration of the vaccine. And it also is expected that the prices will vary between the municipalities this year. The pharmacies is a supplement to this system, and I will present how this is done in a later slide. We can go to the next slide. Here I will just give you a picture to present then the situation with the coronavirus and the pandemic situation in Norway. We have nearly 13,000 reported cases, but only 265 deaths today. We had the first wave of cases in March, April. During the summer months, we have a low number of infected people, but we see on the right hand side here that the numbers is now again increasing, and it's increasing especially amongst younger people, students and younger people. And this has some effects on the focus we now have on the flu vaccination. In the next slide, I will then focus on how we have developed a national service for flu vaccination in the country. It all started in 2017 when one of the pharmacy chains cooperated with some GPs, and the GPs prescribed vaccines, but the pharmacists or pharmacy technicians, they administered the vaccine in the pharmacies. And that year, 1,300 vaccines was administered in 23 different pharmacies. It was a great success. And in 2018, we agreed, all the chains agreed together with the Pharmacy Association to develop a flu vaccination service for all pharmacies in the country. We defined an educational program and made some defined national standards on how this should be done. And that year, we achieved 12,000 vaccinated people in the pharmacies. The success continued. More pharmacy staff was trained, and last year we were able to vaccinate 39,000 people in the pharmacies. All these vaccines was administered after a prescription from the GP. And what will then happen this year? We have had some very positive news in our country, and you will see on the next slide that in August this year, the 31st of August, pharmacists gained the authority to prescribe flu vaccine. So now we are in a new situation. People in the country don't need to go to the doctor to get the vaccine. They can go directly to a pharmacy and both get the prescription as well as get the pharmacy and the vaccine administered. This is important when it comes to the pandemic situation. There is a very high pressure now on the health system, and it's important for people to be able to choose where they would like to go to get the vaccine. And we experience that even if the price on the vaccination and the vaccine might differ from GPs to pharmacies, people tend to go to pharmacies, and they are very positive to that service. So in the next slide, you can go to the next slide again. In 2020, we are in a situation now where we have published a standardized prescribing procedure for the pharmacists in the pharmacies, and we did that the 8th of September, only 8 days after the regulations was published. That's really breaking news for us. It's the first time that pharmacists are able to prescribe in Norway, and we have defined a program where they have to go through certain e-learnings. Unfortunately, this slide is in Norwegian. We have the material only in our own language. But in the middle, this is a list with different e-learning programs that they have to go through, and they have to read certain procedures and manuals before they take test to be then authorized to prescribe the vaccine. These days, people are working hard out in the pharmacies to be authorized to prescribe the vaccine, and there is a lot of activities also to train more people to be able to administer the vaccine. So this is the prescribing part, which is now in place. And in the next slide, you also will see that we have a fixed standard, national standard for the administration. It's important that we know that every pharmacy follow the standards we have. And when it comes to administration of flu vaccines, we have experiences back to 2018. And our experience is that pharmacies are following the standards, and people are very happy with the service. We also see that staff in the pharmacies, they are very polite. They report the vaccines they administer to the national register as it should be done. And we get much positive feedback on the service. On this picture, you can see the president of our association getting his vaccine last year in one of the pharmacies. And the focus is now to also educate more pharmacy technicians to be able to administer the flu vaccines. And the pharmacists, of course, so that we have a very high capacity to administer the vaccines. We have long opening hours in the pharmacies, and we are really now motivated to do an important job when it comes to vaccination this October. In my final slide, I have just listed some expectations for the flu season. We are now in a situation where all the pharmacy stakeholders, they are very committed to the flu vaccination service. there's a lot of activities going on to be able to vaccinate many people in the pharmacies. The pharmacies, they are ready to prescribe and administer the vaccines, the prescription part is done only 4 weeks after the changes in the regulations. So I think that's a very, many people has done a very good job here. The whole pharmacy wholesalers, they are ready to distribute vaccines to the pharmacies these days. And as we speak, the first flu vaccine might be prescribed by a pharmacist in our country. What would then be the next step? We heard earlier in this webinar that it's really important to focus on mass vaccination. And it's a big challenge. We are now preparing to be able to be a part of that important process. Today, we don't have the possibility to prescribe the pandemic vaccine in the pharmacies, but there is only minor changes to be done before we can do that. So we are preparing and working to be in a good position to be able to vaccinate when a vaccine is available. This was my presentation. I'm looking forward to any questions.
Thank you very much, Hannah, for this presentation and for including breaking news. And also congratulations on being able to, after such a short while, really give the possibility to for pharmacies to have guidance in terms of their new role as prescribers. So thank you very much also for sharing, and congratulations on that achievement. So now we move on to a Q&A session, and Matthew and Bram have already been busy answering some of the questions that we had on our Q&A chat box. However, maybe I would give the floor anyways to Matthew to reply live to a question we had from Luna El Bisri about the flu vaccination target. And Luna's question was whether the flu vaccination target, which you mentioned in your presentation, established by WHO, whether it is tailored per country or if this figure is international. And maybe you could expand on that beyond what you already kindly replied in the chat box.
Sure, and thank you, Luna, for your question. So the simple answer is that 75% rate is what the WHO set as an international flu vaccination rate, a target vaccination rate. They set it or put some prerequisites on it to focus on the elderly, those who are most vulnerable, those with comorbidities and NCDs, and the very young, in other words, the most immune naive to influenza. So it's an international or a global vaccination rate. It's not necessarily targeted, tailored per country. So like in the UK, you wouldn't say, oh, it's 70%, whereas in the States, it should be 75%. It's just a blanket 75%. And that is what countries try and aim to achieve. And I think, as Hannah has just illustrated, in Norway, it is below that 75%. And that is what certain national immunization programs, national authorities kind of say, well, we are below the target rate. What do we need to do to reach the target rate? And that is all about awareness, addressing vaccine hesitancy, improving flu vaccination uptake rates, maybe through pharmacists, through other healthcare professionals in care homes, etc., etc. So that target rate helps drive some of the activities to achieve that target, but it is not country specific. It is a global kind of expectation rate as such. And it was endorsed by the European Commission, so it is an EU kind of recognized rate as well. I don't know if other regions on the planet or other countries on the planet have formally endorsed the rate, but certainly within the EU it has been. Maybe
Thank you very much.
Sorry.
Thank you very much, Matthew, for that clarification. And I will now I will go to Hannah, but I would also like to hear from Bram on this one, because to Hannah I will be asking the question in terms of what is happening in Norway, but then maybe Bram can expand on the importance of vaccination for people with non-communicable diseases. But Hannah, Astrid Koch from Austria is asking whether pharmacists vaccinate all patients, also patients with NCDs?
Yes, we have. We vaccinate more or less everyone, but for the time being, we will not vaccinate children below 12 years old, and we have decided also not to vaccinate people on certain medications. But we vaccinate both people in the risk groups as well as people, other people that would like to have a vaccine.
Thank you. Bram, can you let us know what are your views in terms of the importance and whether pharmacists should be vaccinating people with non-communicable diseases? Bram, you have to switch on your microphone. Yes.
You can hear me now? Yeah. I think that I would answer that question with, in principle, yes, unless there are certain circumstances that it cannot be done. But in general, I would say because the people with non-communicable diseases are by far the most important risk groups which they are targeted, and easy access to vaccination, which may often be a pharmacist, is a very good place to get your vaccination rather than to do a specific visit, etc. So from my perspective, whether that NCD patient with asthma or with cardiac problems or whatever goes to the physician and it's time of a vaccination, then it's of course easy if he gets it administered at that visit. But otherwise, it's also very easy if he goes to the pharmacist and for whatever reason and gets his flu shot. So there's no a priori contraindication for pharmacists to vaccinate unless, again, under specific conditions which physicians should indicate them. And I think what is extremely important is the documentation, so that if somebody has been vaccinated either by a physician or by the pharmacist, that it's documented centrally or somewhere, so that you avoid that people get different shots different times and no documentation.
Thank you very much, Bram, and that's a very important question in terms of sharing the information and making sure there is no duplication, but also that we can make people aware at every opportunity of the importance of vaccination. And I must apologize to Astrid because she's from Switzerland, of course, and I mentioned Austria beforehand, but thank you very much for your question.
Same answer.
Same answer, exactly. That doesn't change the answer, right? So we now have a question again for Hannah in terms of the preparation of pharmacists. And we have another question from Luna asking whether pharmacies, whether only pharmacies that have pharmacists who attended the special education course are able to provide the vaccination. So is prior education mandatory?
The education programs are not mandatory, so we have to focus on motivating both pharmacists to prescribe and to do the educational program or the training, as well as the technicians also to be able to administer the vaccines, so that we have staff available all opening hours. Today, it's not every pharmacy that's able to vaccinate, but it's increasing, and we hope that we will pass 900 pharmacies in a short time.
Thank you very much for your reply. So we have another question, and it's let's see if I can interpret this one, and Hadida Suki can tell me whether I've interpreted the question well or not. So the question is whether the supply, if the supply match demands to achieve the rate that you mentioned in terms of the vaccination covered per country, or globally. So my interpretation is whether the demand, well, whether the supply is targeted to the demand. So whether there is the production of the vaccines take into account the global targets that we want to achieve in terms of vaccine supply and administration.
So, Emma, if you wish, I'll have a go at answering that. So it really depends on the demand in country. So what vaccine manufacturers try to match is the demand in country, the amount that is required per country as much as feasibly possible. But if you turned it round and said, do the manufacturing community have sufficient capacity to supply 75% of global flu vaccinations, then arguably maybe we don't. So if you look, for example, to the US, the CDC closely monitor these figures, and Bram every other year produces a very nice publication that talks about the vaccination production versus the vaccination uptake rates. In the US, cumulatively, the vaccine manufacturers supply around about 150, 160 million influenza vaccines. If you think about the United States as a whole, there's about 300 million people in it, slightly more maybe. So arguably, in that illustration alone, we're not meeting that 75, or we can't meet that 75%. But there is still such a long way to go in terms of vaccine uptake rate, and manufacturers do have certain capacity to improve their output, as it were. So it's a kind of supply meeting current expectations and demand. If demand increased or improved, say through a change in the national immunization program, such that it drove that 75% target rate, then vaccine manufacturers have the capacity to adjust to meet that demand as and when it comes. So it's a kind of moving kind of dynamic based on the demand in country, the uptake rate. And like I say, Bram, you produce this very nice publication every other year that talks about how much vaccine manufacturers have supplied and how much has been taken up by a respective country, etc.
Can I add one thing to that?
Of course.
Because that's very much the case. Manufacturers can increase capacity, but they do only according to demand, because it's a seasonal product. You cannot use the vaccine or you cannot put it on stock and use it for the next year. So you produce on demand. But what is not possible is to suddenly increase, like in an emergency situation, suddenly increase and fill the gap between the normal rates and seriously increased rates, because you need to have advance notice. Matthew has shown the production cycle. That's not done just like that. That needs time. Yeah. So it's very important to balance demand and supply, is that there is in advance a good insight on what the demand might be. And if that means we need to produce more as producers collectively, then that can be done. But it cannot be done at the moment that you need the vaccine.
Yeah. So arbitrarily, manufacturers need almost a year's advance notice ahead of what kind of vaccine quantities are going to be needed. It's about a 12-month window that's needed. And for that, we need to have close interactions and close collaboration with national governments, member states, and their health authorities, who are ultimately purchasing, distributing, and supporting vaccination programs within country. So it's a close interaction with the purchasers, basically, in-country purchasers, and that is needed almost up to a year before the flu vaccine manufacturing starts, so that we can order sufficient eggs, if eggs is the main way of manufacture, which is still predominantly so, but it's not the sole way. and disposables, managing kind of other kind of resources like the critical reagents, etc., that are used to test and release the vaccine. All that lead time factors into that early diagram I showed that where we shifted that 6-month window. There's actually a 12-month window prior to that in some respects.
Thank you, and that's why planning and cooperation and good communication is so important in this process.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, Hannah, we have a few questions here on the chat box as well. So, very straightforward question from Tony Bjork from Sweden, saying good job in Norway, and whether those documents that you share could be available for other countries to learn from. So that's a very straightforward question. So thank you very much for that. And then we have a question from Tsuchun Chu. What Tsuchun asks is whether the Norwegian government plans to reimburse the vaccination service for pharmacy vaccinations. How does it work in terms of reimbursement and payment on behalf of patients? What was the reaction, or what is the reaction of doctors, physicians, and other healthcare practitioners on these new advances?
The feedback from the GPs and the other health professionals varies. Of course, we get some negative feedback. It is some questions regarding the reporting to the National Register for Vaccination. There we have proved that we document and we register what we do. So I think these comments, we don't need to focus that much on them. We see that we have a very good service, and cooperation with the health authorities is very, very positive. And when it comes to reimbursement, people in the risk groups, they have a fixed price on the vaccine, and some of them also get it paid by the authorities. Today, we don't have a reimbursement system for the vaccines in the pharmacies, but this is something we will work on in the future.
Thank you very much, Hannah. And a very short question before I go back to Bram with one question I have here for him. Do pharmacists in Norway only vaccine for flu, or are you able also to vaccinate for other diseases?
We are able to vaccinate also for other diseases, but then we need a prescription from the doctors, since we today only have the authorization to vaccinate for flu, seasonal flu. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your quick answer.
Emma, I think you've gone back on mute.
Sorry. I have a question here for Bram, whether Ifpma has data about how the introduction of pharmacy-based vaccination in several countries has impacted flu vaccination rates. We've been saying that vaccination through pharmacies potentially increases vaccination rates. Does Ifpma have data, or do you have any data about this?
No, we don't. We have data globally on the distribution of vaccine to countries. So we know how much doses of vaccines are distributed to countries, but we don't know what happens in the country, because we don't monitor what happens in the country, who gets it, and what are the effects. So I cannot answer that question.
Anecdotally, though, Emma, I can share from the Abu Dhabi session last year, one of the attendees, and I can't remember which country they're from, it was an African country, said that because pharmacists had taken up the mantle of vaccinating against influenza and demonstrated, that it's a beneficial thing to do, they had expanded their remit and were taking on other vaccinations. So maybe, I don't know, yellow fever or any other kind of diseases. So that was not necessarily a formal, but an anecdotal evidence of where a pharmacist community in country have taken on vaccination against, in this case, influenza, and then it's been expanded to administer other vaccines. And I think there was a South African delegate who spoke and said the doctors and the healthcare community in South Africa recognise that by pharmacists taking on this responsibility, it takes away some of the kind of the other responsibilities of being a GP, of being a doctor, and positions that responsibility with pharmacists, giving the doctors and the clinical professionals, clinical practitioners, more kind of space, more time in their agenda to deal with people with chronic diseases, etc. In other words, not administering the vaccinations that pharmacists are eligible and able to do. So I think within the pharmacy community, there are anecdotal evidences and information. And we heard that, like I say, from a couple of colleagues in the Abu Dhabi workshop last year, which was really interesting and beneficial.
And
apologies if I haven't remembered.
There are also some publications. I think I remember from Portugal. There are publications on the effect of when that was introduced, how that affected the immunization rates. So there is some evidence there, but we don't collect that. I mean, I took the question as, do you collect that information? No, we don't. But I think there is out there some information, and including in the literature.
Yes, thank you. And it may be an interesting outcome of this event that we propose, that we have a platform that collects this kind of data. Like Graham said, there is evidence, and I know particularly from Portugal, from the US, we have seen differences in terms of vaccination coverage between different states where vaccines, community pharmacy-based vaccination has was taken up before. So there are differences, and there is data out there. Maybe it would be a good outcome from this session and a good recommendation that we could create this platform where we would be collecting that information globally. So thank you very much for your replies. And now we have 2 questions, and maybe these would be the last ones, and these are very important questions. One of them is about safety and whether there is a pharmacovigilance system put in place in terms of, for instance, monitoring of adverse events following immunization for the pharmacies. And maybe Hannah could answer this question, and I don't know if Matthew or Bram would also like to talk about this issue in terms of safety.
We have a system for reporting incidents. We have the same system as the doctors will use.
Thank you.
And certainly it is very important that pharmacists do not only report any adverse events or any kind of side events, but also the fact that people have been vaccinated against flu. I mean, ultimately, as Hannah's just indicated, information has to go back to that home, to the home doctor, to the person's GP, to collect that information. And that information is so key for health agencies, health authorities in country, when they monitor how many people have been vaccinated against flu and the benefits of the flu, and that factors into the vaccine effectiveness assessments and calculations, etc. So it is really important that pharmacists don't operate in isolation, but report through to whatever the system is in country to report that the person's been vaccinated and if there's any issues. And key to that is the training of pharmacists, which comes back to what we've talked about at a number of FIP congresses now. It's the training of pharmacists to be able to identify, monitor, report, deal with any adverse events, and then document through to the home GP and national health system.
Yes, and that's important at national level, but also at global level, because WHO has a safety unit which monitors the safety of drugs and medicines and vaccines. So once in a number of years, they collect the global information on safety and reported serious events. And I think that is extremely important in modern times, when there's so much concern about safety and people are skeptical and people don't really trust. So those are systems which are in place, and we need to rely on them. So reporting of pharmacovigilance is extremely important also for building trust on national but also on global level.
Yes, definitely. And this should be included when we are educating and training pharmacists for vaccination, that we ensure that there is this awareness of the importance of reporting. And also, like Hannah said, in terms of the system that is used, that we do not create parallel systems that, that will ultimately fragment the information. With this, we need this information collected and feeding on one platform where we can get the global data and act upon that data, and ultimately spread the data, and really to curb some of the myths and lack of reliable information on vaccine safety, which we have seen unfortunately going viral on social networks, with very which puts us in a very difficult position to then answer back, because we know how social networks work, and it's very difficult to then counter some of the information, not very scientifically based information that goes viral on the internet. So thank you very much for your contributions. We have another question on vaccine shortages, and whether there are systems in place, or whether there is a global or national, in the case of Norway, indications or guidance in terms of what are the priorities we should take in terms of the patients that we will include if there are any vaccine shortages.
As I said in my presentation, the municipalities are responsible for vaccinating the people in the defined risk groups. And as far as we know, they will have access to the number of vaccines needed to vaccinate people in the risk groups. And in addition to that, we have the pharmacies, who has also a certain number of vaccines available that will be distributed through the pharmacies. So there are discussions in the media whether there will be a shortage of vaccines this year, but the numbers says that there will be, if more people than earlier year go and get their flu shot, we still have vaccines available.
Thank you for that clarification. We have here a comment from Astrid from Switzerland. Do you have an electronic vaccination card in which the pharmacists can register and validate the vaccination? How does it work in practice? In Switzerland, Astrid mentions that they have a website, which is the www.myvaccines.ch, where they collect that information. How does it work in Norway?
We have a national register, and the people living in Norway have access to their vaccines, so they can see what has been administered through the years. So we report directly to the national register.
Thank you. And we have an additional question here from Bruno Rosa from Portugal, and he asks whether authorities in Norway have data on the percentage of the immunization rate which is done in the pharmacies. Do you know that percentage break in terms of what percentage is administered in pharmacies and what percentage is administered elsewhere?
No, we don't have that figures yet. We know that last year 39,000 vaccines was administered in the pharmacies, but we don't know. But this year we will get some indications on that figure.
Okay, thank you very much again for that information. And finally, because we really, like I said, we really have to finish on time because we have other events starting in half an hour. There is one issue which is very dear to me, and I think that FIP has also been addressing with Ifpma, which is about vaccine hesitancy. And I was talking about the myths and information that goes viral on the internet and is not really reliable information about vaccine safety, and it increases public's hesitancy in vaccines. So my question specifically, and it goes both to Anna and Ifpma, and I don't know if Bram or Matthew would like to reply. Do you have a particular strategy to address vaccine hesitancy? Do you feel that this is needed? Do we need a strategy for addressing this issue? And maybe we can start with Hannah and then go to Matthew and Bram as we finish our Q&A session.
We don't have a specific strategy at the moment, and I think it's the national health authorities that communicate around these questions. It's not the pharmacies, but of course there is a lot of questions in the pharmacies, and we try to support them with facts so that they are able to answer the questions they get.
Yes, so it's not only, of course, we can organize campaigns, and again, this may be a recommendation from this panel that we think about a campaign which we can organize, which addresses this issue, but also the day-to-day conversations we have with patients are so important in reassuring patients about the safety of vaccines and the benefit of an increased coverage. Matthew and Bram, do you have anything to say about Ifpma's strategies around this issue?
Yes. Although we have different strategies and tried different strategies over the years, so I can't say that we have a specific strategy. But Ifpma is involved in an influenza hub social media campaign where they are giving information and on specifically on the disease. It's the Influenza Hub, and I can supply the link. And that is really targeted at specific risk categories, elderly or children or healthcare workers, where we really have interactions because the system is built that people can ask questions and answers, and so it's really not a top-down sort of messaging, but really an interaction and having the opportunity to take questions seriously and to answer them as good as possible and as balanced as possible. So that's one strategy on social media. The other is the reason for Ifpma to take the initiative of an influenza network is basically to develop a, let's say, one voice type of messaging for the key issues, because you can find everything spread around. But the more organizations and stakeholders stick to the common and balanced and evidence-based information, because that's where we have to stick to, and what is our strongest point, but also our weakest point. You know, it's much easier to have an opinion without any background whatever. And it's much more difficult to really build an opinion which you know, and then to demonstrate that that has a value, or that's a more valuable argument. So that is extremely difficult. And I think and we talked about it when we were talking about safety. It's the global safety, as I said, is one of our tools we have to at least make sure that we have solid and balanced answers. And we have to stick to that part of it. We cannot just have opinions and etc. But it's extremely difficult to come with facts or to go into all sorts of arguments. But the more the stakeholders are keeping on the one voice to the key messaging, the stronger that message is. And not for the anti-vaccine people. I mean, that's impossible to convince. But for people who are really looking for, let's say, qualified data and information, that is extremely important when they go to different reliable sources and find the same messages.
Thank you, Bram, for these are very, very important messages. And you mentioned one of the groups there, which is healthcare professionals. And us ourselves as healthcare professionals, we don't have optimal vaccination coverage either. So it has to really start with us and
exactly.
our own attitude towards increasing vaccination coverage, and then being able to convey that same message aligned with the global message will reinforce people's attitudes towards
exactly.
vaccination.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for those words. Matthew, I don't know if you would like to say some final words as we close our webinar.
Just to sort of reiterate what you mentioned a moment ago, that, you know, pharmacists could run a kind of education of the public campaign, a hesitancy kind of campaign, because pharmacies being on the high street, etc., and a kind of a friendly face, as it were, from a clinical perspective on the high street, are in an excellent position to advocate and provide information and reassure people of the benefits and the advantages of vaccination. Vaccine hesitancy is immensely complex, and there's a lot of people who look at it, and national authorities try to address it, and where Ifpma tries to do is support those kinds of discussions to provide industry's perspective wherever possible. But there is a catch-22 there, that people say, well, you only want to improve vaccination rates to sell more vaccines. So there's a balancing act even there, really. But it's where can we provide education and support to people to mitigate their hesitancy and their reserve, their concern about vaccines. And that is where pharmacists could really provide a significant benefit, I think.
And I think where Ifpma can support FRP if they want to be involved in or develop educational materials or things. We have done a lot in the past, and influenza didn't change very much except the strains.
Yeah.
so we can help there and provide, let's say, the basic information for educational programs or courses or whatever.
Thank you so much. And this only reinforces what I said earlier about the continued support of Ifpma to this FIP strategy to increase medication coverage. And it's all about benefiting patients with through the pharmacist expertise and all the capacities we have for being so close to the population and being a trusted healthcare professional that really can make a difference in terms of vaccine hesitancy and in terms of mitigating some of the barriers some people face when, even if they want to be vaccinated and the system isn't tailored to their specific needs and expectations. So thank you so much for this amazing panel. Thank you for your contribution, your expertise, and thank you to all the participants. We had over 150 people already participating live in our session, Zoom and Facebook, and we expect to see this number increase in the next few days while when you access our webinar recording. Thank you so much for viewing this event, and I look forward to seeing you in further events during this FIP Virtual 2020 week. Thank you, and I would also take this opportunity to invite you all for a very exciting event next Monday afternoon. We will be launching our FIP development goals, and we look forward to seeing you there as we clarify what this project of FIP is and where we see pharmacists contributing to healthcare systems and patients' health, in particular in the future. Thank you so much to all who attended, and Bram, Matthew, and Hannah for sharing your expertise with us. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
A very good day or night. Bye.
Thank you, Emma. Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you.